second.
Second, Shead.
Brendon third, no preference.
So just to make sure I've got it right, Ollie Soph, Udai Soph, yeah, and Will Cat Brendon Will.
Yeah.
Sweet. Sorry, I just can't really keep up when I'm tipping it on my phone. In terms of timing, I encourage you all to time yourselves, but I'll try to give you, at the very least, the regulation clap down at 8:15. And without further ado, I welcome first up. Got a problem, mate? I got the ballot right here.
For too often and for too long, political ministry positions have been seen as a badge of loyalty to your party and a fact that you've been a friend with the current PM for a while. What we're going to prove to you in this debate is by extracting the ability or by getting rid of the necessity that someone is an MP in order for them to sit in a ministry position, we're going to achieve better governance. There's a couple of bits of setup and a model to go first though. First things first, it is not necessary to appoint someone who isn't a member of Parliament, but it would be allowed in our world. Secondly, the Prime Minister would be able to pick the appointment, but would also be able to dismiss them, just like they're able to do at the moment. And thirdly, all of the existing accountability mechanisms, such as being able to vote a no confidence for the government and other forms of accountability through MPs would exist at the moment, would exist in our world as well. Couple of observations here to make. The first is that this setup explains why there would be a high degree of accountability in our world, and that's because all of the same mechanisms that exist for accountability now would continue to exist, and the fact for non-political, non-MP cabinet ministers. The second observation is just to say that this is not a breach of democracy, and that is because in our world, these appointments are still an expression of the Prime Minister's will, and people have voted indirectly for that Prime Minister. But secondly, these positions don't need to be outsourced, and most importantly, people still are picking their Member of Parliament. That Member of Parliament still has the capacity to critique the ministry positions and critique their decisions, so there is still access to democracy as well. The final observation to make is just that these are pretty high-profile appointments, which would likely attract people who are experts, but who also want to see their career develop even further. And because there would be so much scrutiny on these positions, because they are such high-profile positions, it means that people would only, attempt to engage with them if they had a good plan and they were able to achieve success, so that it would benefit their career. The final thing to note is that, I can't read what I wrote. Okay, so major point then, why we get better governance, and there are a couple of sub-points within this. The first premise is just to explain that we simply have access to more expertise if we are able to pick from non-MPs. And that is to say that currently the existing pool of members of Parliament is quite limited. For example, in Australia, there's 151 seats. By the time you factor in that half of those or less than belong to the losing party, you only really have 80 MPs you could possibly allot this position to. Some of those are juniors, some of those are inexperienced. So you're really only thinking about a handful of people who have probably been in the party for a long time, or who would even have the expertise to do this. The next thing to note though is just that the process of entering politics, being voted in by a constituent, just doesn't necessarily correlate with your ability to run a ministry, and that is because a ministry position is an executive branch of government rather than a legislative one. The roles that you're doing are different, it requires different expertise, and most importantly, the types of people that succeed in elections aren't necessarily the types of people that you would want to be leading this, or that have likely had to suck up a fair amount to the party in this case. In our world, what we are able to do is draw from a domestic or international pool of subject matter experts, and would point to the example of Canada, who had a British person running their Bank of Canada for a while to great success. And simply put, this leads to a higher likelihood of being able to get a knowledgeable technocrat into a position. I want to briefly then touch on the fact that at the moment, the norm is that in this world, it is likely that these certain positions would, let's try that again. In our world, it is likely that norms would develop so that certain positions go to technocrats rather than other ones. And that is to say, if you think about presidential systems at the moment, for example, in America, the Secretary of State is normally a politician, but people like the Secretary of the Treasury or the Secretary of Defense normally are technocrats, like high-profile economists or generals. And that, I guess, shows that in the status quo, there are good incentives that operate on PMs, or in that case, presidents, to pick people who actually would do a good job, because those things are so important, and because it is quite obvious to see that they don't rely on the same political skills that foreign policy do, like as a Secretary of State, but instead rely on much more hard matter knowledge. So why is it more useful to have expertise, or at least the capacity to access expertise in our world? And the negative will obviously tell you that members of parliament who are appointed to ministerial positions can simply learn or take advice, but we would note that this is insufficient for 4 reasons. The first is that it simply does just take a very long time to actually get up to scratch with what your department has been doing for the last few years. And we would say that secondly, that compounds with the fact that there are often short-term election cycles, that often governments change, but most importantly, cabinets reshuffle all the time. And what that means is that people spend probably more time actually learning what their position is and learning what has historically happened, rather than actually acting in that position. And we anticipate that a technocrat who has the confidence of the government and the public would last in that position for longer and do a better job, plus they would just have the basic knowledge of that field already. The third thing to note is just that advice sometimes isn't useful if someone doesn't understand the subject matter. And that is because sometimes you do just need to make trade-off decisions and weigh one piece of advice against another, especially if those pieces of advice are conflicting. And when you have a non-subject matter expert doing that, they tend to anchor to certain biases. Maybe they just listen to the lobbyists that they like. Maybe they listen to the head of the department, which is also not good, because that department head has separate career incentives, like wanting to justify their budget or grow their department and the people underneath them. Or maybe they just toe the party lines. But what that means is that by having someone with, and the final reason it does though, is that having a technocrat allows them, well, that experience allows them to direct exploration of policy ideas in dimensions that otherwise would not have occurred, because they are familiar with the status quo and the policy issues at the moment, and they can actually think on their own rather than relying on some junior analyst or a 22-year-old McKinsey intern to tell them what to think. So why is better governance good? Obviously, it means that people are able to do their job more immediately, which means that there is less of a run-in period before you have ministers actually doing their role and creating change like they were asked to do. The second is that in times of crisis, they are simply better able to respond to those times of crisis. And the third reason is that people trust that government more. For example, people would much more readily trust a health minister who was a doctor or who is a doctor rather than someone who did like a law degree at UC. The final reason is that this probably leads to better interactions with the department head. That is to say, you both mutually respect each other, rather than a department head who's been there for 20 years who doesn't respect an MP, and there would be a more confrontational sort of approach, which would probably delay policy or delay thoughts in that regard. Second part of this argument then is to say that, or second reason is just that this is an easy way to exclude people who would do a bad job. And I guess the intuition here is that in the status quo, since you have to appoint an MP, often those MPs aren't the best candidate for the job, either because there is such a limited supply of them, or because like many of them are just old or corrupt or have gone through the party system and have toed the party line for so long that they aren't able to think on their own. But also because many countries have so many ministries, like the UK, which has 300, that you end up appointing most of your MPs anyway, so you don't even have the capacity to select the very best ones. Third reason why we get better governance is that we avoid bad career incentives, which is to say that MPs who are allocated these ministerial positions may be pressured to, maybe fall to electoral incentives. They toe the party line because they want to keep being pre-selected, or they are subject to personality politics, and for a completely unrelated scandal like having an affair, they're not put forward for a ministerial position that they would actually do a good job in. Whereas experts have a career that they can rely on afterwards and would do a better job. Fourth reason is just that experts are more accountable. It's easier for them to blow the whistle because they have a separate career that they can rely on, but also there is a larger body of MPs to critique them, because when you have an MP that is a minister, all of their friends or like their cabal of left Labour clique or whatever are less likely to critique them than if you have a separate technocrat minister who would be more up for critique. Finally, this frees up MPs to actually spend time legislating, reading legislation, contacting their community and outreaching to them and doing a better job representing them. We are proud to propose.
I thank both staff for that speech and welcome both names.
Two parts to the speech. Firstly, why this is undemocratic. Secondly, why it leads to bad policy outcomes. But all be integrated. On why it's undemocratic, I want to start off with the weighing of this point. This team brushes over it, and I know it's commonplace in debates about democracy. Sort of think of this sort of airy-fairy, it's not as important as the practical issues in debate. But this is tantamount in this debate. There are a few reasons why fulfillment of representation as a principal goal is something you should care about. Firstly, because the government has the power through the exercising of the powers of its ministries to take away people's rights, to put them in jail, to take away their financial freedom, and that power is only justified when people have as much of a direct say as possible to how that power is exercised. So we ought prioritize representation where we can. Obviously, we can't prioritize it in every single situation. There is a point where technical expertise is valued as well, but we ought err on the side of prioritizing representation. Secondly, because it is the revealed preference of most people living in democracies to have democratic representation in their government. People would be shocked if you were saying that if you could prove that a policy would take away democratic representation, people in most cases would not like that policy. But thirdly, because to the extent that you believe representation is important, we tell you that this representation of the minister in charge of a portfolio is the most key link that there can be between democratic elections and the fulfillment of government policy. This is the one person who is elected, but also is the one that's leading strategic direction of that policy. That is not a replaceable role that you can necessarily get someone else to do. So the next thing to prove in this point is why this role is meant to be a representative one. Why is the minister meant to be representative? The first thing I'm going to do here is prove some structural reasons that suggest to you that it's not meant to be a technical role. Because of course, MPs don't have as much expertise as a technocrat who's worked in that department for 30 years has. That's obviously true. We're not going to contest that. But the system is set up so that that works, right? For a few reasons. Firstly, because the minister or the party changes every 4 years or so, or has the potentiality to change every 4 years or so, which means that the system is built in such a way that this person isn't meant to be this sort of technical expertise, because you don't want to be too reliant on that one person in case they change. So you're meant to have that technical expertise that stays through regardless of the party. Secondly, because there are lots of technocrats, obviously, that actually write all the policy, that do all the things that this department does. The role of the person in charge isn't to decide the wording of the law. It is to, oversee what's going to happen generally, make sure that they're following the strategic direction. Of course, they have less expertise than all of their advisors that do 99% of the work. But thirdly, there is no guarantee that there is an expert for the reason this team explains, which is why it's designed to not be reliant on this person having expert knowledge. Why they're designed to have advisors who are skilled in communicating expert knowledge to a person who is an MP who doesn't necessarily have that knowledge. Why then must it be representative, and how is it representative? Firstly, to ensure that the policy enacted by a government's executive is ideologically consistent with the legislature that was elected directly by the people. Secondly, to ensure that there is communication of that policy back to the people to get buy-in with the policy that is created. And you need someone who's been elected who has that rapport with the people who is able to do that. Why must it be democratic then? 3 reasons. Firstly, because even in the most objective of policies, there is no objective standard of what is good. It is always a political decision about what policy to pursue. So, for instance, economic policies, like how to get out of an economic crisis, are still moral trade-offs of whether we should sacrifice people's well-being now or people's well-being in the future by taking on more loans. Those are questions that a technocrat cannot answer. The second thing I would note is that the parties campaign on their policy, and this is the way that they enact that policy that people have voted for. And this team relies entirely on the Prime Minister to be able to appoint someone to do that job. That's the only democratic representation they get. And that one person obviously does not have the capacity to oversee every single department, particularly as they say in the UK there's 300 departments or whatever. Obviously that one person doesn't have the ability to convey that information in a way that is acceptable. But thirdly, we think that there are re-election incentives and transparency incentives that exist on our side of the house. If that person wants to get re-elected, they have incentives to make it clear what's going on to make sure that it is in line with what the party wanted. This right gets realised. People vote on it. They don't like when things like the budget aren't in line with what they voted for. We think it's super, super important that in this debate that you ought vote on that sort of policy. Why then, that policy is representative. Why then is this policy bad on their side? Firstly, I'm going to give 5 reasons why it's likely that the people who are appointed are not good people for those roles. They're not the sorts of expert technocrats that this team wants. Firstly, because often they are appointed for corrupt reasons to various degrees. So, for instance, if I just point to examples from America, right, where there is a system that is analogous to this, where the executive is appointed, you have Trump appointing hacks like Rex Tillerman. You have Bush appointing a bunch of his cronies that are just doing exactly what he would say. Those people are able to do that, and that is the norm, right? They talk about a norm that goes by, oh, we respect the treasurer or whatever. The norm is that whenever a Republican gets in, they just appoint a whole bunch of cronies. That seems bad to me. What does this look like in the system? So it looks like cronies, which can, I know, be an expert in a field and still be a total hack who does whatever the leader says. But it also looks like lobbying increases, right? You have business executives and lobbyists that undertake quid pro quos with the government that's trying to get elected. So if they, fund the campaign, they'll get a person who gets a ministerial portfolio. And of course, they're going to say, well, people hate when it's not democratic. But the problem is, it's really easy to justify to voters that, well, this person's such a good business person, so they must have that technical expertise. They'll manage the books really good, which means that people get behind it and you actually get that sort of erosion of democracy. You get big corporations being empowered. The second thing that happens is often politicians or leading parties, when they have a really unpopular policy, they'll just pick a martyr, right? Like someone to go down with the ship on their side of the house. Because it's not an elected person, because it's not one of them, they don't really mind. And that means when you have a really unpopular policy that people don't actually want, there is limited democratic accountability for that policy. Because the person who's suffering the blunt of that impact is like Kerry Chan, right? Like it's someone that people actually aren't able to vote out. People are less likely to think that is a problem. The third, and of course the government can be like, oh, well, we thought they were good when we appointed them. So people don't actually blame the government as much. Third reason is when the Prime Minister is perhaps not ideologically aligned with most MPs on a particular portfolio. This is a situation where they can hijack the democratic will of most elected MPs and just put their personal agenda into that portfolio, right? They pick a safe bet that is not representative, and that's not what voters would have wanted. It's bad. And I think the fourth reason is an extension of this, is that this just enables democratic backsliding. That is to say, it empowers the one person at the very top. If that person has autocratic tendencies, this just makes it so much easier for that person in a developing state, for example, to appoint some generals to a position, or appoint particular people who are just going to do whatever they say and help cement the power of the government in the hands of one person. That is bad, even if it only happens sometimes. But finally, I just think the politician can now take away other MPs' portfolios as political punishment more easily. That's probably bad. And I would note that these reasons explain to you that the majority of these appointments are done in bad situations, and that means these people are bad at their jobs, or even if they're good at their jobs, they're doing them in a way that is bad, pernicious, etc. But even if they're appointed well, in their best case, why do they still do a worse job of running those ministerial portfolios? Firstly, because they don't have the re-election incentive. They don't care as much about doing a good job because their job isn't directly on the line as much as a politician would be. And that is just important to doing a job that is in the will of the people. And secondly, it's just hard to coordinate across multiple policy issues if you don't have those people in the parliament discussing the broader spectrum of those issues on the day-to-day. Semester rebuttal to affirmative, you might take a while to learn it, but that's mostly symmetric, right? Because maybe you're a faster learner on their side of the house, but you're still new to that portfolio, you still have to learn it. They say you might exclude people who do a bad job, but I think most MPs aren't cabinet ministers anyway, you can probably do that. For all those reasons. Okay.
Thank you first, Neg, and welcome to the
The first thing I'll prove is that this policy is democratically legitimate and indeed democratically good, for I think about 5 reasons. The first observation I'd make is that the status quo is just convention-based. In most states, this is a norm drawn from the Westminster system that exists because of inertia. It is not a deeply held preference of voters. But secondly, the status quo is actively undemocratic in many portfolios. Firstly, because as we point out to No Response, politicians, unlike technocrats, are uniquely vulnerable to lobbying. See the influence of prison owners like Geo Group on criminal justice in the United States. See the mining lobby's influence on environmental policy in Australia. It's far more likely that you as a politician who has to rely on that money, who doesn't have another career to turn to, who doesn't understand the workings of that industry, is vulnerable to lobbying on their side. But secondly, cabinet ministers in the status quo aren't your local representative whom you vote for directly with the knowledge of what sort of portfolio they will have. They're a random person voted for by other people, and you don't think this person would represent my interests vis-a-vis health, so I will vote for them to be the health minister. Not at all. The kind of democratic benefit they get is vastly more diffuse than they attempt to claim. But thirdly, I note that they concede in mitigation later on that, well, technocrats do 99% of the work anyway, so that massively cuts down at their principal benefits. But thirdly, even if you believe their argument, it's an extremely small infringement on democracy for three reasons. Firstly, ministers on our side are selected by the Prime Minister, who is selected by the people. This process is the same as you would use to choose ministers in the status quo. Secondly, we note that this doesn't apply to all portfolios. It applies specifically to portfolios where expertise is most relevant, for instance, something like defence or the Attorney General, and least to portfolios where politics is less relevant. So they can say there's not always an objectively true trade-off or objectively correct political decision. That's of course true, but you should believe that those are the portfolios where we are least likely to use this sort of minister. But fourthly, I note that the purpose of democracy isn't only to give power to the people, but also to serve them. And in general, we support democratic systems because we believe that the aggregation of people's preferences leads to policy that serves the people. They say there's no objectively good policy. Sure, that's sometimes true, but for instance, if you're like an idiot defense minister and you're like, we should get more tanks because they seem cool, because my electorate would think I'm really like macho and important, which sounds silly, but is literally a reason why people purchase more tanks in some instances, then that is not an objectively good policy that is well informed. There are many instances when there is a correct thing to do and when politicians don't do it. And that is not always true. We're very often happy to outsource governance when it is clearly in the interests of the people to do that. For instance, outsourcing monetary policy to unelected reserve bankers. So we uphold a different purpose of democracy better, even if we, concede some elements on like the representation of the people. So that argument is out of the debate. At the very least, it's a wash. I think it's a principled win to us. Secondly, then, let's look at the important half of the debate, which is about governance. We explain very clearly at Ollie, and I think to not very much response, why we get more expertise, why that makes policy better, but we exclude the worst candidates, who in many systems on their side, are just forced to have portfolios even when they are just simpering idiots. They will avoid the worst kind of political incentives that make people make short-term positions or mean that people are allocated irrationally. And importantly, we free up politicians to do the things they should do and are best at doing. We free them up to legislate, to read up on legislation before it gets put before committee, which is something that politicians often are extremely time short on doing. We allow them to outreach to their constituents. All of that means governance is vastly, vastly better. We improve that on our side. What do they say? The only really responsive claim they make is, well, technocrats do stuff anyway. That's preempted by Ollie. We explain that politicians often don't listen, that in the worst cases of corruption, they have an incentive not to, that it takes time and energy to listen, that often they can't parse this expertise, and you need your own knowledge in order to understand what other people are saying. I know that there are many issues where lived experience allows you to point to questions that might be of relevance. For instance, being a police officer who has worked in a police department with a culture that encourages police brutality might have an understanding of what sort of solutions we would put forward, or whether, for instance, increasing or decreasing the number of police officers in a given department would be positive or negative given the cultures that exist. That's not something that the average person would think about unless you're someone with expertise on their side. So, technocrats have more power on our side, which is good. What's their aggressive material then? Their basic push is like, what if things go wrong? What if there's corruption? What if you just appoint your cronies who do whatever you say? There are a range of reasons why this is a pretty accountable system and why good people are likely to get in. The first thing I'd note is that these people are chosen by and can be dismissed by the Prime Minister. And obviously that response doesn't land if you think the Prime Minister sucks, but a great deal of the negative team's analysis is like, we should uphold democracy and the will of the people. So you should believe that their faith in democracy translates then to the faith in the Prime Minister, who has the ability to appoint and dismiss these people. But secondly, technocrats have far better incentives vis-a-vis accountability and corruption than politicians do. They have career incentives, not in politics, but in their own field and by their own peers, who are likely closely watching them and are likely highly educated and skilled. For instance, if you are a top of the standard economist or a health person or whatever, probably other people are watching you and taking note of what you do to do well, so that you aren't, for instance, pilloried by other people or other economists who think you just did a self-interested thing rather than serving the people. We'd note that you have another career to turn to, so it's less likely that you have to just play by what your party wants. They say you'll just do whatever the politician says. No, that's true in the status quo for ministers who are appointed, and his whole livelihood rests on being seen as popular within their own party. I note, secondly, that you haven't dropped the culture, like the Kool-Aid of parliamentary culture in instances where often there's a lot of groupthink about what good policy is or isn't. And finally, you don't have skeletons hidden in the parliamentary closet. So it's much easier, for instance, for your peers within Parliament to blackmail you or to say you should do X thing because otherwise we'll reveal this scandal or this affair you had when your previous professional life is separated from Parliament. So it's much more likely they get that kind of coercion on their side. But thirdly, I note that you're usually going to be a more famous and interesting person if you're some expert in another field, which means your decisions likely attach much more media attention than just being a random minister does, which means there's much more scrutiny on what you do and therefore more accountability. Fourthly, I note that politicians often suffer huge amounts of lobbying. They say this goes up, but this never explains why. And, intuitively, I guess it would go down, even in the worst case where you're like, evil people get appointed. Now they don't have to lobby. They do it in the light of day, which is presumably better. Fifthly, I note that this is moderated by needing to justify that the person you chose is good to the public, which is the mechanism they give, right? They're like, we have to explain to the public that he's a good guy and is going to make good decisions. That's great, because it means that you don't pick the worst people to be those parliamentarians. But finally, I note that accountability matters less than getting perfect policy, because overturning and changing policy is a harm in itself. It's expensive and time-consuming, which we really hate. And also, it just causes huge distress and chaos, particularly on issues like, say, changing immigration law or changing criminal justice law. So you should prioritize getting policy that's pretty good in the first place. The best version of the harm they can give is maybe you appoint the bad guys. So maybe in some instances you appoint like the head of Rio Tinto to your environmental department. Why is that in many cases a benefit? Firstly, it's a good thing because those people are experts in general on their industry, but also experts on the dark side of that industry. They know the tricks of the trade, they know where their bodies are hidden, they know how to evade regulation, and so therefore can make regulation better. But secondly, I know that being money hungry in one industry doesn't mean that you're going to prioritize your old industry while you're in government, because you're in a different culture and environment. Your incentives change because you're probably no longer like working for Rio Tinto, and I assume there'd be laws against that. But you're signing up for politics rather than just wanting to hang out or make money, which indicates you probably care quite a bit about your communities and are a good person. Maybe you've seen the dark side of your industry, so are likely to want to turn against it and regulate it. It's also just illegal to do cronyism and just appoint your friends to things, obviously. And the comparative is that those evil people otherwise just lobby governments, which is far less accountable both to the party and to the public. This is, I want to note, some worst case, like even if analysis. If evil people or so-called evil people are appointed, we think that's unlikely, but if it happens, it's still vastly better than the comparative of under-the-table lobbying. This gets better policy and that's a democratic good.
Thanks, second out, and welcome second day.
Yeah. Like as long as measure feeling no.
I feel like
You're a trick queen.
I want to start this speech by clarifying what exactly it is that cabinet ministers do, because as we explain at will to willful ignorance from this affirmative team, cabinet ministers are not the guys that perfectly plot out and write out the legislation and decide, every minute expert detail of policies in particular areas. Cabinet ministers are surrounded, as we explained, by a bunch of other technocrats who possess that knowledge, who advise them. And the minister is in charge of the ideological direction of the department and of communicating that direction and that policy to people, which is why you should believe that this is primarily a representative role rather than purely a technocratic one. I'm going to do two things in this speech. First, I'll deal with the principle, and second of all, I'll deal with policy. First of all, on the principle, their claim is that, well, we get sufficient accountability without voting, and they suggest a couple of things. They suggest, first of all, well, the Prime Minister can, dismiss and critique you, and that guy's voted in. So by, in a truncated way, you get direct accountability. But second of all, they suggest that things like no confidence votes, etc., also exist. This is insufficient for 3 reasons. And I know that these reasons also respond to the claim that this is just an issue of convention. Yes, it is conventional. We think that convention is in line with democracy. 3 reasons. First of all, because ministers, as we explained, serve an independent representative role. They serve an independent representative role. They do things like communicate policy. They do things like communicate the ideological direction of that policy. And we explain to you, to no specific response, that people deserve control over what that looks like. Choosing the head of state is not sufficient, because you also need to be able to select your representation in this area, given this is a representative role. But second of all, we suggest that these people make important moral trade-offs, which require moral questions. And I'll explain in a second why it is the case that their responses to that fail. But thirdly, we would suggest that the accountability mechanisms that they describe don't work, like things like Prime Minister critique or no confidence votes, do not work in the terrible situations that we describe. And even if you believe those situations are rare, they are extraordinarily high-risk situations. Things like scapegoating, like the Prime Minister wants to dismiss that guy. That's the whole reason he's appointed him. Things like corruption, of course, the Prime Minister is not going to dismiss their crony or their crony. Those things fail. Even if you don't believe those accountability mechanisms fail all the time, at the very least you should believe they fail at important times, and that is enough to suggest that these roles should be elected. They have a few additional responses at Sophie, which I'll deal with now. Their first response is, well, you didn't vote this person in for this, like you didn't vote for them to be the education minister or the health minister. I guess that's true, but it's uncomparative. It just suggests that this representation is imperfect. But we would prefer that that at least some group of people in this society have decided that this person is fit to represent them in some capacity, as opposed to the Prime Minister, who we explain like that's too divorced from your actual say. But also we explain that Prime Ministers are likely to do so badly. We think this is, yes, maybe imperfect, but at the very least fulfills some of the role that we describe. Their next claim is that, well, a career incentive is better than an incentive for re-election, and that's why these people are creating good policy, and therefore that's a more important principal function. I'll deal later with the policy claims, but I want to deal specifically with the principal part of this now, which is that maybe this is true if you believe that cabinet ministers do most of the, technocratic work of crafting policy, but we explain that is untrue. And we flip this claim to suggest that given that this role is primarily front-facing, or even if not primarily front-facing, given the most important and most specific parts of this role are the front-facing and representative ones, you should prioritise people's ability to have, at the very least, some amount of say over who that person is. Their final response here is just to suggest that, well, this doesn't apply to every single ministership, it only applies to the ones that are expert focused. But first of all, they don't explain why this is the case. We suggest to you that politicians often have ideological or personal reasons to select particular people for particular ministerships. And maybe it's true that some norms evolve and that not every single person is chosen badly every time. But we suggest to you a number of incentives that make prime ministers and heads of state choose badly. They are often corrupt, they often are lobbied. All of these things suggest that this is not just sometimes, this is in important cases, and that means you should prioritise this principle and weigh it independently. I'm going to turn now to policy. Their claim is, well, now you'll bring in people with expertise, and that is good. The first thing I want to do is just contest whether this is true most of the time. We explained a series of situations where these people are not selected well and where they produce enormous harm. That is instances of corruption, instances where the Prime Minister is an extremist or has a particularly rogue ideology, and they select the heads of and they select the ministers based on that ideology. Thirdly, we suggest things like they choose scapegoats for particular unpopular departments so that they can push through their own policy. And the note that I'd make here is that the risk, we explain why these things are likely, but we would note that the risk of these things is extraordinarily high compared to the marginal increase. And I'm going to explain in a second why the increase in expertise is marginal. But all of these things are high risk. They are, at the very least, you should believe possible, and where they do happen, that is important. The second thing I want to explain now is, even where it is true that you, in their world, bring in someone who has more expertise, why is the benefit of that particularly small? First of all, as I suggested earlier, technocrats advise them anyway. You have bureaucrats and public servants who are crafting this policy, which means that the benefit, you have an entire department, the function of expertise is more than fulfilled. And they try to, I guess, sort of preempt this at Ollie when they're like, oh, it's just like some McKinsey intern grad. Of course not. This is an entire department that is an entire department. The expert that they're describing in a lot of their analysis, seems like they're working in the department in the alternative world anyway. Of course, there are a number of experts. This isn't just a bunch of consulting club. Second of all, we would suggest that the more important roles, that is the front-facing roles, the part of the role which makes important political trade-offs, elections, those are the most important roles as we explained. And the reason they're more important is just that people interact with them super directly, like your interaction as a voter with the Department of Education is with the guy who's communicating the policy to you, which means like the actual substance of the policy is less important than what they're telling you. And we would note that elections select particularly well for those kinds of things. People are good at voting for people that are charismatic, whose communication they understand, which just means even if you believe that this person is slightly less of an expert, they are far more likely to fill a number of other important functions, and that is the focus of this role. And the final thing I want to explain here is just like the benefit that they describe isn't even a straightforwardly good one. Like they're like, oh, well, you expand the number of possible policies, or you do proper crisis management. First of all, they don't explain why you require an expert at the top to do those kinds of things. Presumably, having creative and well-educated experts throughout the department also helps you to expand the number of possible policies that you can do. But also, we would suggest that this person at the top, like moving the most talented person to the ministership, is bad because now they have party loyalty. As they say, this person can be dismissed, and their claim is like, oh, well, you have a career incentive. Of course, being dismissed for not conforming ideologically to the head of the party also tanks your career and also makes you look bad. But second of all, as we explained, these are not straightforward policy questions. They are important political questions, and that is why you all believe that representation is more important. Their next claim is just, well, you avoid idiots. First of all, MPs are highly skilled in ways that are useful, as we explained. It's not like you have 50 of the dumbest people ever, and the option to import an expert. Of course, heads of state have choice of good people. But second of all, if the Prime Minister is good, they have every incentive to choose that person well, even if those people are not experts. Their final claim is just, oh, well, this frees up time. Of course, Parliament is structured in such a way that makes this fine hard to navigate.
Thanks, second neg, and welcome third act.
First on democracy, then on technocracy. Let's start with democracy. And I note that this is the part of the debate that the negative team spends the bulk of their time on, and yet shockingly little of the 8 minutes it's received so far actually goes towards a contentious part of the argument, which is actually explaining why non-MPs are any less democratic in the first place. Because compare the two chains of accountability. In status quo, voters elect a prime minister by voting for, their local MP. The majority of MPs from one party then get to select who the prime minister is. That prime minister then appoints a minister. On our side, the voters vote for their PM via the MP, who then appoints a minister. It's literally the same process. The only distinction they can point to is that in one side, the pool of people who could be appointed a minister by the prime minister is anyone, and on the other side, the pool of people who could be appointed to be a minister are people who have also been elected to parliament and are probably in the same party as that person. But there's no explanation as to why the fact that they were elected for an entirely different role or different job increases the democratic mandate that that person has to be a minister in any way. The fact that the people in the seat of Batman thought that a particular candidate would be good at being their local MP is not really an explanation as to why there'd be a more democratically representative health minister than any other person that the PM would point to. In both instances, their legitimacy for holding the ministerial role comes from the Prime Minister, who has a mandate from the country writ large, suggesting that they ought to hold that role. It's not the fact that the people in one constituency, which the vast majority of people in the country don't live in, happen to elect them for an unrelated job. So I think there's a huge paucity of argumentation here explaining why it is that this is in any way important. And we would note that all of the same incentives, fetters, and discretion broadly exist on how the PM would pick, which is why I'm going to address the 5 sort of problems they identify with how people might be appointed, which is really the only analysis we get here. The first thing they say is that Trump and Bush picked some people who they personally feel were bad candidates. One, you could just pick MPs in the status quo who these guys might believe are bad candidates. There's no analysis given as to why Rex Tillerson was a bad Secretary of State. We point out yet a vast amount of foreign policy experience. And if your objection is just that he believed things that you disagree with, many Republicans or Democrats might also believe things that this particular team disagrees with. Secondly, they say lobbyists will just try to get themselves appointed, but presuming lobbyists have the capacity to get themselves appointed and are sufficiently influential, it seems equally likely that lobbyists could also just convince a minister to do whatever it is they want. There's no explanation given as to why one is more harmful than the other, and secondly, it seems extremely unpopular for a prime minister to appoint someone who is well known as a lobbyist for the mining industry to be the environmental minister. Thirdly, they say, what if the Prime Minister has different interests and incentives to the rest of his party, so he'll just pick people who the rest of the party doesn't like? Well, he could already do this. He could just pick ministers who happen to agree with them, even if they don't represent the majority party position. The reason he would not do this is, the MPs can defenestrate him, and he won't be PM if the party doesn't want him to be, so he has incentives to cater to the remainder of the party, which would presumably still be true whether the appointment was of someone who is from Parliament or not from Parliament. Fourthly, they say you can just pick a martyr to implement a policy and they don't need to worry about the unpopularity of it all. Firstly, this happens frequently in politics as is. I think a very good example is Tim Fischer, and gun control under the Howard ministry. He literally lost his re-election in pushing through gun control. Presumably you could find a technocrat, you could probably find a politician to do this. So at the end of this set of, and finally, their example on this argument is Kerry Chan, which is one, an example from the status quo, and two, a good example of implementing technocratic policy that saved lives. So it seems at the end of this, all of the harms they identify of how you could pick someone bad symmetrically could be achieved by just picking a particular kind of MP in the status quo. And two, there's no explanation as to why any of these things actually lead to any meaningful harm. Just gestures and insinuations at the fact that these are right-wing people who we kind of don't like and should not be in power. But that is not a substitute for an argument, and you ought not credit it that way. So at the end of this, it should be very clear that the issue of whether or not this is democratic is entirely symmetric. There is no reason to believe that there is any less accountability for these people than there would be comparatively. Let's then move on to the question of governance, which is where the bulk of this debate takes place and where the most important benefits accrue. This team gives you 2 claims as to why this would be bad for governance. The first is they say that these particular career technocrats would not have re-election incentives, therefore they won't want to do a good job. Firstly, many politicians do not have re-election incentives, and that would be true of them as well. That would be a reason to believe that presidents in their second term would do a particularly bad job. That would be a reason to believe that politicians who are retiring would do a particularly bad job. Or that would be a reason to believe that politicians who are almost guaranteed to lose their seat would do a particularly bad job. We would suggest the empirical reality often demonstrates that these people are freed from political incentives and now able to pursue policy making that is in the best interests of the country, rather than the very short-term political incentives that might otherwise operate. Many policies only pay off in the long run, and these people, we say, have incentives to care about their long-term career, to care about their legacy, and to care about the capacity to gain work in the future and their public reputation, all of which are probably better incentives than whether or not a specific group of people will re-elect you in a year's time. Secondly, they say there'll be less coordination now. No analysis given. 1, you could still have cabinet meetings. 2, these people would have far more time to meet with each other because they're not also MPs, don't also have constituent duties, don't also have to legislate. So it seems like it'd be far easier to get a much higher degree of coordination. And 3, obviously they'd still be capable of meeting with MPs or discussing those issues as needed. So this seems very unlikely. So, at the end of all of this, most of the claims this team makes don't really stand in the debate. You must then weigh that up against the claims that we give you, and I note many of these receive little or no response. Let's start with the ones that receive no response. We explain that this frees up the vast majority of MPs' time to do things that are more important and that they're actually required to do. Firstly, things like actually legislating and making laws, which is the core duty of a member of parliament as a legislature. And this matters because, as this team demonstrates, voters vote in politicians to do things, and they should actually do those things, which requires them to pass laws and to make sure those laws actually operate in a way that would achieve the outcome that people would want. It's why you get things like the Bail Act of 2013 that has been repealed and amended 39 times in literally 11 years, because they don't get it right each time because of the drafting errors, because of an inability to pay attention to what's in it. Secondly, it's things like committee work. It's things like, interviewing civil servants, or having regulation, or bringing in companies for Senate inquiries, and actually checking that the law is reflecting the things that it's meant to on the ground. But finally, it's things like constituency work. It's things like members of the community being able to talk to their MP, raise their concerns, talk about issues happening at the local level, which we would note is where the biggest scale of impact of governance can happen, because that MP has a very large capacity to change what occurs to the individual constituent. But it's also the place where trust in government is built, because it's where you have the closest interactions with people in actual positions of power. This receives no response from the affirmative team. Secondly, we explain this as a very way to exclude the worst candidates from government, the most corrupt, the most senile, the oldest members of parliament who you don't want in particularly important seats, or just people who are very politically extreme. Think about, for example, what the US would look like if MTG, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or AOC, was required to have an important cabinet post, as opposed to a world in which they can be easily excluded. And their response is just to say, well, you have lots of ministers to pick from. We provide structural analysis down the bench as to why there's often a very large number of ministries, why there's often a very small number of people to pick from. Finally, we explain that this expands the talent pool, and that's useful for 4 reasons. Firstly, because you can jump into the role faster. Yes, obviously you still take some time to get up to speed on the role, but if you're already a subject matter expert, it's much less. Secondly, you can weigh the various advice you get, so you're not dependent on a lobbyist or on the civil servants or on anyone else, and you know the right questions to ask to see where the bodies are buried. Vote side affirmative.
I thank that affirmative, and welcome to that negative.
I want to begin on the question of governance, and the reason why I'm starting here is because it's the opposition's only argument. In this issue, they would need to prove to you that the people doing the appointing and then the people being appointed will largely do this job well, whereas if we can show that in fact they will do a worse job, or that maybe they do a better job but it's marginal, then we can very clearly walk away with this debate with our principle that never really receives the comparative response. Which is to say that this issue is life or death for this affirmative team, but we can win this debate in other ways. Let's first prove why governance is far worse. I want to begin with where the opposition are at their strongest, which is on their material on corruption or the distortion of politics to meet narrow special interests. Their claim is that technocrats are immune from lobbying because they have a professional career to fall back on. Yeah, a professional career in lobbying or a professional career in the industries that the lobbying organizations represent. They concede that there still exists a department head role, which suggests to you that the types of people they are filling for this role are not people within the bureaucratic apparatus, it is people outside the bureaucratic apparatus. And we would note that for these people, their day jobs, if they are not the appointed minister, are likely to be one of 2 characterizations. Firstly, if they're just like policy experts generally, it's very likely they'll be working for institutions like think tanks, the largest consumer and customer of which are lobby groups who necessarily use research and think tanks to fulfill their special interests. Or they might be experts in the sense that they've worked in the field that the policy field is adjacent to. For instance, a business leader being the Treasury, in which case there's a pretty obvious conflict of interest there. Now Sophie's like, well, it might be good for the CEO of ExxonMobil to be the environment minister because maybe they'll know where all the skullduggery is. But that's not what they're there for. Like, they're not taking up the political role because they've had a sudden change of heart. They're there to be the industry insider, to crack down upon any government attempt to regulate out that skullduggery in order to ensure that the shares that they're still invested in are likely to go up, which is why this is likely to be a way in which you get internal insiders in. Now, they're like, this would be very, very unpopular to do so, but empirically we know that when this is done, like in the case of the United States, the people that populate these roles are industry insiders. But moreover, just listen to all the rhetoric aside Affirmative. These people are experts. They know what they're doing. Politicians are kind of bad. It's a very easy way to sell that to voters and then use that against voters. The next claim is like, well, your field will come critique you. We've explained that your field will pat you on the back because you're working against the interests of the people for your particular field. There's an inherent disalignment there. Now, their best response is to say, well, the politicians, they're also already in the pockets of lobbyists, so what's the difference? Well, the difference is that a politician, yes, will also have to cater to lobbyists, but crucially, are still accountable to voters. So, the set of people that are taking these roles in our need to balance those two interests. Whereas the set of people that these guys rely upon only have one master, and that's the lobbyist firms that they come from, or necessarily the industries that they represent, which suggests to you that the worst case of corruption is far, far worse in their world. That has two implications for us in the debate. Firstly, it's clearly the impact which has the greatest instance where the democratic spirit is violated, so our principle is most significant in this particular characterization. But secondly, it's an instance where not only do we get slightly worse policy, we get harmful policy that is actively against the interests of the people. So, on the issue of corruption, we are already ahead on this issue quite significantly, and it's the most significant portion of the government's issue. Next. The next question to ask then is, when are ministers typically outsourced? Side Affirmative just assert that it's like the outsourcing is likely to occur only in the instances where technical knowledge is the most relevant. They've never explained why a political party would have the incentive to do that. Remember, these are still parties that are self-interested, that would largely enterprise in order to win elections, which means that they are only likely to do so if it's likely to maximize their chances. And Side Affirmative never proved that technical performance correlates with electoral success. We give you 3 instances in which that correlation is inherently disaligned. Firstly, in the instance where you need a scapegoat, like the party knows that their policy platform is likely to be extremely unpopular, which is why you pick a random person and then throw them under the bus to say, well, that's not our policy platform, they just acted against our interests. Very clearly, parties won't delegate issues departments like Treasury in the instance where they want to get the credit, which means that this policy is only likely to be used in the instances when parties want to avoid any blame or scrutiny for their actions. So very clearly in that instance, it's likely to result in worse outcomes, and also in the outcomes where it obfuscates accountability. Secondly, they do this to overcome a lack of political will. We're not saying it's in instances where the Prime Minister disagrees with their party. We're talking about instances when the Prime Minister's party itself does not really have a strong enough majority within the Parliament. So, given that they can't turn to someone in the Parliament who may not be in the same party as them to be responsible enough to delegate their ministry, they take their power to do so, which means they're effectively able to govern with a supermajority even when they did not have that majority, which clearly explains to you why this policy is likely to be used in an instance where they do not have the democratic backing and the democratic will to do so. So, then, because of the way in which this is likely to be used, it's likely to be used to thwart the democratic process, to undermine policy achievements, rather than necessarily provide better policies. So, what does the opposition say here? Their kind of primary benefit is the idea that, well, it might come at an opportunity cost, like they have other more important things to do so. But we would note that if you believe their characterization is correct, the vast majority of politicians don't have the kind of technical expertise to run these departments, probably suggests to you that they probably could benefit from that level of expertise, and it's important that they have a part in that process, right? Like, it's not an opportunity cost. The fact that they're a department head means that they are better informed of how the policy is likely to be enacted, which means that they are likely to make better decisions on what policies to implement in the first place. So this wasn't an opportunity cost. It was an important additive role in the roles and responsibilities of this politician. So, clearly this is not a harm. So, the next thing I want to then prove is actually that this role is unlikely to be very, very technical. For the reason that Side Affirmative give a lot of really plausible reasons that everybody would know when designing a political system to suggest that most politicians aren't likely to be selected on the basis of technical expertise. which suggests to you that those roles were not designed with the need for that expertise to be in mind. We have explained to you that these politicians, when they're the head of the department, fulfill a very, very narrow function. And that narrow function is to merely ensure that the policies being carried out by that department are in ideological line with the party or the government in charge. In that setting, it is unclear why any of their reasons as to why these politicians have the policy execution knowledge is necessary, because they don't do that. They delegate people who work in that bureaucracy, whose careers are in the bureaucracy to do that. They're there to make sure that the ideological consistency is in line. And if you believe that characterization, that immediately neutralizes all their benefits by technical expertise and only strengthens our principle, which suggests to you that this should be a representative function and therefore should be representative of the people. So, having explained that, it's very clear that at best, for this side, governance is actively worse. At worst, it is marginal. So, let's then enter the issue of the principle in this debate. So, I think the problem with the opposition here is that a lot of their reasons to explain why it's not likely to be very democratic are true of both sides. Like, it's true of both sides that people vote on a plethora of issues. It's true on both sides, almost all the other reasons, to the point that they are still relying upon people holding the Prime Minister to account to indirectly hold the department head to account. So, the relevant part of this principle is, do we rather that proxy, indirect way of holding them to accountability, or the direct way of holding them accountable by directly voting in that department head? And we give you reasons at first negative to very clearly suggest to you that the importance of this role, such that it doesn't really trade off any kind of technical expertise, given that it's not really a requirement of the job, it's very, very necessary then to ensure that these people get voted in. Firstly, because their job is to largely communicate this. Sorry, yeah. Okay, well, you've heard that. Anyway, cool. Right to a vote.
I thank the neg and welcome the neg reply.
First on representation, second on policy. On representation, Affirmative's strategy down the bench is to compare the two systems and point out how, firstly, there is still some representation on their side, and secondly, how our representation isn't perfect. So the fact that there is some margin shouldn't matter to you, because why would that margin be the tipping point? Why would that margin be something that you as the panel should value? The problem with this is disproving these two claims was never our burden on side negative. All we had to prove is that you ought, and as we said down the bench, you ought err on the side of prioritizing representation for the structural reasons that we give at first negative to no response. And secondly, that this particular role is one where representation matters significantly. And yes, it's not perfect representation. We don't vote in the particular person to be the health minister, but it was still important for the reasons we gave you that that person who was the health minister was someone who was voted in. And that's the claim that this team never defeats, is that that person is particularly important to be representative. I'm not going to spend much more time on this issue because I don't think their rebuttal engaged with the core of the argument, but I do want to weigh it particularly highly. At the point where both teams very clearly agree that 99% of the actual policy work is done by the technocrats in the department anyway, you ought to care a lot less about the practical arguments that this team points about. Like, yes, maybe they're not an expert, yes, maybe they've got other time that's not freed out, but this team explains why 99% of the time that is a less important impact. You ought to weigh the principle in this debate because it's the thing that matters. When the actual practical impact is much smaller, that is when you ought to err on the side of principle. That's why side negative wins. Let's talk about the practical impacts though. I first want to start off with their benefits, when the people are chosen well. Then I'll talk about our harms, when the people are chosen poorly, and then I'll weigh them off against each other. On their benefits, they point to two key benefits. There are a few other missed ones, but I think my teammates deal with it. The first is expertise, and we heavily mitigate this at second negative. We give you a range of reasons to explain why expertise is not important in this role. Actually, I do it in my speech as well. We give you reasons why this person is meant to be a communicator, is meant to be someone who oversees strategic direction, isn't meant to be someone with that technical understanding. And I guess their response is to say, well, you exclude the worst candidates, like these old fogies who have to be appointed to a ministerial position. But the problem with this is we explain in 90% of cases, this isn't an issue because you've got so many people to choose from. And Udai says something like, oh, but we have structural analysis. Your structural analysis is saying, look at the UK, they have a lot of portfolios. I don't think that was structural enough for this point to fly. The second point that they give is that this frees up time for MPs. A few problems with this. Firstly, Kat explains why the system is set up like this so that the MPs don't need to have lots of time to fulfill their role. But secondly, Brendon explains why this is an important part of the MP's role. If you want to make good laws as a legislator, it's important that you have understanding of the way that those laws are enacted as an executive member. That is something that we're uniquely able to capture. That's why it's additive, not a trade-off on their side of the house. So their benefits are pretty marginal. Like, even if they happen, I don't think they happen to an extent that you should care about it, even more than the principle. But, unfortunately for them, we also proposed to you a series of harms that happen when this person is chosen poorly. And note that this person need not be chosen poorly in a majority of the time. They only need to be chosen poorly in, say, 5% of cases, and that is still something that is reasonably significant. We explained the harms of cronies and lobbyists being appointed, of democratic backsliding being happening when the Prime Minister has too much power, of scapegoats and martyrs being appointed, which, it doesn't seem like a direct harm, but it is an avoidance of accountability, which is important no matter what sort of policy you think is objectively correct. And fourthly, you just get blatant political appointments that are against the democratic norms of society. What are their responses? Firstly, a set of reasons why maybe the Rio Tinto guy is good. I just think that for the reasons Brendon explained, that's not true. But also, as we explained on the bench, then Rio Tinto wouldn't have agreed to the quid pro quo if they were going to be harmful to Rio Tinto. Obviously, this person acts in the interests that are better for the corporation that they come from. Their second and more important response is that this person is accountable. But the question is to who? If it's to the Prime Minister, we explain why it's a bad thing. If it's to their field, we explain why, unless it's like healthcare, that's probably a bad thing as well if you're accountable to corporations. If it's to the public, we explain why that doesn't happen, because the public doesn't have the ability to kick them out. And as they explain, this person has another career. You ought weigh this material more highly because of the size of the impact, but also because it compounds and is visibly harmful to democracy in the future. Vote side negative.
Yep, I thank the neg reply and welcome the F reply.
What's symmetric and what's not? Democracy, accountability, and governance. First, on democracy, we mitigate this point down to almost nothing. We explain, one, that the status quo is imperfect. The negative team relies on technocrats by their own admission. Politicians suffer from undemocratic lobbying. People, most importantly, don't directly vote for cabinet ministers. We explain, secondly, that this is a very small infringement on democracy. You're voting through the avatar of the Prime Minister, and that this only happens sometimes, not for all portfolios. And I know that that doesn't mitigate our benefit, which applies to expertise-heavy portfolios, given politicians would want good policy on these issues, but it does substantially mitigate theirs. And the negative team chucks mud at the wall and cries uncomparative again and again. But this does not a winning argument make. If your vote matters 1,000% more than it would otherwise, that doesn't give me reason to care about that increase to democratic legitimacy, because that increase is so marginal. But secondly, we explain to no response at second that we are not uncomparative, we win on this issue, because good governance increases access to democracy and fulfills one of its central purposes. Because increasing civil liberties when media outlets are well regulated is what we provide on our side. Because money in people's pockets when the economy is well run means people can take time off work to vote. We win the principle, we win the practical, and it does not matter in this debate. Second thing that they don't win on is accountability. And I want to note here that the negative team's path to victory is an unfortunately symmetric one. The first observation I'll make on accountability is the negative team relies on an extremely unlikely and extreme characterization of technocrats. technocrats as people who are in the pockets of lobbyists, uninterested in serving the people, despite the fact that they left millions of dollar paychecks in order to join the government, but people who wouldn't otherwise turn to lobbying if they weren't allowed directly into the government in the line of public sight. And the negative also forgets that the Prime Minister can fire these ministers. So either the government wants to regulate mining and cares about the environment, so they file an environmental minister who is proven to have done bad things, or they appoint an MP who then fails to regulate the environment symmetrically. And they give no reasons why politicians can't select the good guys from the pool of talent that we provide. Their best claim maybe is on scapegoats, but again, this is uncomparative. We explained that you could find an MP to fall on the sword, and Udai explains that scapegoating can sometimes be a Trojan horse for powerful political changes. See the case of gun control. But we also just give a suite of other reasons why technocrats are held to account by the media, by their peers outside of Parliament, by their party, and by the changed incentives they have, as indicated by making enormous, in a lot of cases, financial sacrifices to take up a government job. What is not symmetric in this debate? It's on governance. At every point, this negative team tries to narrow the debate. They say, well, technocrats do everything anyway. All cabinet ministers do is communicate with the public and determine the political direction of the portfolio. If this is true, this cowardice hurts the negative team because it undermines their principle and also their argument about corruption, because corruption applies more so to granular decisions you're making, not communication with the public, which is intentionally visible, or things like appointments that people can look to. But that cowardice does not hurt us symmetrically, because communication with the public, which they say is their main job, takes enormous amounts of time, which could otherwise be spent on investigations, committees, constituents outreach, and reading legislation, which I would note, contrary to the assertions of this team, very often parliamentary members simply do not have the time to do, and where their governments would be improved by having more time to do that. It takes expertise, and you benefit from trust that the public has in cases like lockdowns or mask mandates, and that big public-facing decisions suffer especially when idiots are allocated to make them, as they are in the UK system and in many others. But we're also more ambitious than this team. We explain that it's just untrue that that cabinet ministers don't play a part in shaping policy, that the political direction of the department is about what policy is shapen and what policy is started, and that if that's true, that's bad, and we simply expand ministers' portfolios and reap huge benefits. Our team is the difference between life and death in a hospital system when you're drawing from an expanded talent pool of health ministers. It's the difference between body cameras or not in a police department. It's the difference between understanding how tech companies avoid regulation and how they don't. We make policy better for everyone. Their arguments don't accrue.
Thank everyone for that debate. I encourage you to cross the floor and shake hands. The panel will briefly confer, and we'll call you back in when we have a session. Should we hold on to 5 minutes to each come to decisions a bit about this?
You're welcome.
Sorry? The F vetoed the top motion on the Conservative Party. That was the second motion of the House of Lords.